The Dark Scrolls. In the hushed corridors of time, among the dim shelves of royal correspondence and brittle parchment sealed with wax long faded to amber, lies a truth seldom spoken aloud. It is the truth of how love was negotiated, measured, and sold beneath the Tudor crown, not as a union of hearts, but as a weapon of state. The 16th century, that restless age of faith and fire, was built upon the quiet signing of promises that would outlive the hands that wrote them. Marriage in this world was not the end of a romance, but the opening act of empire. When Henry Tudor seized the English throne in 1485, the ink of civil war had barely dried. His claim was fragile, his enemies numerous, his dynasty young. Yet he understood something his ancestors had not, that bloodlines could be bound not only by the sword, but by the ring. In the candlelit rooms of Westminster, scribes drafted betrothal contracts, thin strips of vellum carrying the weight of kingdoms. They were not romantic gestures, but political armaments, signed between men who seldom met, and children too young to know the fate being prepared for them. The earliest records describe betrothals as binding as marriage itself. To break one was to invite divine wrath and political ruin alike. Thus the game began. Nobles and monarchs weaving alliances through infants' hands clasped in ceremony, promising futures not yet lived. In the Tudor world, affection was irrelevant. Lineage, inheritance, and loyalty were the true currencies of affection. When envoys from Spain, Burgundy, or the Holy Roman Empire arrived in London, their interest was not in peace treaties, but in the exchange of brides. Each offer of a princess carried with it the echo of cannon fire, or the promise of trade. It was Henry VII, shrewd and quiet as a spider, who first understood how such unions could fortify a crown still trembling on uncertain ground. His court, cautious to the point of paranoia, became a place where whispers of betrothal could start wars. He betrothed his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, a match of immense prestige, uniting England with the might of Spain. Yet behind the celebration, letters between counselors reveal the unease. The dowry demanded, the political leverage sought, the calculation of what would happen if either child died too soon. Arthur, pale and scholarly, was the vessel of his father's ambitions. Catherine, devout and proud, was trained since childhood to marry not a man, but a crown. Their union, performed under gold-draped canopies and guarded by priests reciting Latin blessings, seemed to seal England's future. But within a year, Arthur was dead, and the delicate architecture of alliance collapsed into dust. What followed was not mourning, but negotiation. Henry VII refused to relinquish Catherine, or her dowry. In the darkness of those years, the seeds of England's greatest schism were sown. The chronicles describe the scene almost clinically. Ambassadors speaking in riddles, papal dispensations drafted and redrafted, every word weighed like gold. The question of whether Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage would haunt England for decades. For if they had not, then she was free to wed Arthur's brother. If they had, then Henry VIII's later union with her would be a sin in the eyes of God. In this uncertainty, the machinery of religion and politics ground together, until sparks flew, and the flames consumed Christendom. Some scholars suspect that Henry VIII's obsession with annulment and legitimacy began not in lust for Anne Boleyn, but in the echo of his father's secret dealings. The memory of that first betrothal, made and broken for political convenience, haunted him like a curse inherited. Every match he later arranged, every wife he took, every head he ordered struck from the block, bore the invisible mark of that first contract's betrayal. The king who would tear his country from Rome did so in pursuit of a clarity that never truly existed. And yet, not all betrothals were written in public ink. Hidden among the dusty volumes of state records are faint mentions of private contracts, sometimes sealed only by word and witness. Some were drawn between noble families, hoping to elevate their bloodline through royal favor. Others were formed in defiance of the throne itself. These secret promises were perilous things. A whispered vow between a nobleman and a lady of royal descent could be interpreted as treason. For a princess to pledge herself without consent of the sovereign was to risk imprisonment, or worse, the headsman's blade. Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's beloved sister, knew this risk well. Married first to Louis XII of France for her brother's ambition, she became a widow within months. What followed remains one of the most daring acts of defiance in Tudor history. She secretly wed Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, out of love. When news reached Henry, his fury was absolute. To marry a princess of England without royal permission was to usurp the crown's prerogative. For days the court held its breath, expecting the Duke's arrest, the annulment of their union, perhaps even an execution. But blood proved thicker than law. Henry forgave, grudgingly, and in doing so established an unspoken truth. Love might bend beneath the crown, but it could not always be broken. Others were not so fortunate. Lady Mary Grey, granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, was born into a web of suspicion. Her elder sister, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, had already died upon the scaffold. When Mary chose to marry a commoner for affection rather than politics, Elizabeth I's court saw not romance, but rebellion. She was imprisoned, her husband exiled, their letters confiscated as evidence of a plot that never existed. In the end, Mary died forgotten, her only crime having been to love without permission. It is within these lives, recorded in fragments of parchment, marginal notes and confessions whispered in cold chambers, that we glimpse the Tudor soul laid bare. To love was to gamble with sovereignty. To marry was to risk a dynasty. Every secret betrothal carried within it the specter of rebellion. Every denied proposal a potential war. Even the great Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, understood the alchemy of such promises. She would never wed, but she wielded the illusion of marriage like a sword, dangling her hand before suitors, foreign and domestic, shaping the politics of Europe without ever surrendering her crown. There were nights when foreign ambassadors wrote home in confusion, unsure whether Elizabeth meant to marry the Archduke of Austria or the Duke of Anjou, or no one at all. In truth, she had mastered the art her forefathers had stumbled upon. Betrothal, not as binding vow, but as leverage, to promise without fulfilling, to seduce without surrender. This became her form of statecraft. And so, beneath her golden image and painted face, the ghosts of Tudor contracts lived on, whispering that the truest power was not in marriage, but in its denial. Behind the pageantry of the Tudor world, its jewels, feasts, and processions, lay the quiet heartbeat of calculation. Marriages were annulled, betrothals revoked, alliances redrawn. Children were born legitimate one day and bastardized the next. The church that had once sanctified union was torn apart by it. Across Europe, scholars and diplomats alike puzzled over England's contradictions. A land that claimed divine order, yet rewrote the laws of heaven to suit its king's desire. By the time Elizabeth reigned, the last of the Tudors had inherited not only the kingdom, but the entire archive of deceit that built it. Each scroll of parchment, each contract signed in candlelight, was a relic of ambition, sometimes sacred, often profane. Within them were not only the names of kings and queens, but the fate of Europe's peace, the balance of faith and empire. Some of these documents remain in fragments today: faded ink, half-burned seals, marginal notes in trembling script. They speak of promises unfulfilled, of unions arranged and broken before they ever reach the altar. And in reading them, one senses that peculiar Tudor irony, that a dynasty founded upon marriage should end with a queen who refused it. The story begins not in passion but in parchment. In the silence of locked chests and sealed letters, history itself was betrothed to secrecy. And as each generation of Tudors took the throne, they inherited not only the crown but the curse that came with it, the knowledge that love in their world could never be private, only political, only dangerous, and never free. Under the same dim light that once illuminated royal vows, the ink of ambition deepened its stain across England's parchment soul. What began as cautious diplomacy under Henry VII evolved under his son into obsession. Henry VIII was born into a dynasty still fragile, a kingdom stitched together by bloodshed and faith, and he inherited his father's conviction that marriage could preserve what the sword could not. Yet in Henry's hands, the sacred bond that once united crowns became a blade sharpened by vanity and desire. He grew up in the shadow of his brother Arthur, whose brief union with Catherine of Aragon had once promised peace. When Arthur died, the ghost of that marriage lingered like an unburied sin. Henry was not meant to be king. His education was that of a scholar, a soldier, a son of privilege, free of the weight of governance. Yet when fate lifted him to the throne at 17, the young monarch saw in Catherine not only beauty and piety, but the continuation of a political dream his father had nearly lost. The betrothal contract drawn years earlier still hung in legal limbo, an artifact both sacred and suspect. The church's law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow, yet the power of Rome could bend where politics required. Papal dispensations were sought and granted, signed in ornate Latin that cloaked uncertainty in holy rhetoric. Historians would later debate whether Henry's love for Catherine was sincere or a convenient inheritance. In the early years, it seemed genuine. Together they appeared as the image of divine order, a young king and queen restoring dignity to a dynasty once drenched in blood. The court poets called them England's Solomon and Sheba, and for a time the myth felt real. But time corrodes all illusions. The birth of sons that never survived, the unending pressure to secure a male heir, and the aging of Catherine beneath the merciless gaze of a restless monarch began to unravel the marriage. What had once been a political triumph turned to theological torment. Henry convinced himself that his union was cursed, that Arthur's ghost, or perhaps God himself, denied him sons because he had taken his brother's wife. The justification was convenient, but the conviction appeared genuine. Within this labyrinth of guilt and ambition, the seeds of schism took root. Court documents, later preserved as evidence, reveal the king's growing frustration not only with his queen, but with the machinery of the church that bound him to her. He began to question the very authority that had once legitimized his rule. The papacy, in refusing to annul the marriage, transformed from ally to adversary. Beneath the veneer of devotion, Henry's court became a theater of quiet rebellion. Every priest, every counselor, every ambassador was drawn into the question that would divide a continent. Could the will of a king outweigh the law of God? The answer, written in blood and decree, would reshape England forever. When the papal court delayed, Henry declared his own supremacy. He would no longer seek approval from Rome. He was God's anointed, and England, his realm absolute. The Reformation, so often portrayed as an ideological awakening, began as a royal divorce, but in the wreckage of love denied, a new order emerged, one where kings could command faith, and faith could no longer command kings. For Catherine, dignity became her only armor. Exiled from court, stripped of her title, she clung to the sanctity of her vows. She called herself queen until her final breath, refusing to acknowledge the annulment that had erased her from England's future. Letters written in her last days speak not of bitterness, but of faith unbroken, of prayers for the husband who had abandoned her. Even as Anne Boleyn rose in her place, Catherine remained the ghost of Henry's conscience, a living reminder that the price of power was always personal. Anne, too, entered the chronicles as both victim and instrument. Her ascendancy, often romanticized, was itself a product of political calculation. She embodied the New England, educated, ambitious, unafraid to challenge hierarchy. To Henry, she represented liberation, not just from Catherine, but from Rome. Yet the irony of power is that it devours those who wield it. The same king who had defied the world to marry her would later destroy her to preserve his pride. The act was not merely jealousy. It was the logic of a ruler who had turned marriage into monarchy's most lethal weapon. In this spiral of unions and betrayals, one sees the true nature of Tudor politics revealed. Contracts masquerading as affection, vows as diplomacy, affection as policy. The very idea of marriage, sacred, eternal, became a mirror for ambition's darkest reflections. Beneath the crown's gold shimmered the ink of duplicity, and behind every bridal procession lurked the silence of the scaffold. Beyond Henry's court, the contagion spread. Nobles and courtiers, taking cues from their sovereign, began to treat betrothal as an instrument of advancement. The daughters of great houses became tokens in games of inheritance, their hands bartered in letters sealed with crimson wax. A single engagement could elevate a family or destroy it. Alliances formed overnight and dissolved before the ink dried. Even whispers of a royal match could ignite suspicion. The marriage of the Duke of Norfolk's niece, Anne Boleyn, had proven that proximity to the throne was perilous. Yet ambition is rarely deterred by history's warnings. The Howards, Seymours, and Dudleys, all families that orbited the royal sun, continued to gamble their daughters' lives for power. The rewards were immense, so were the graves. By the late 1530s, the network of secret alliances within the Tudor court resembled a labyrinth. Every noble had a claim, every claim a rival. In the absence of papal arbitration, England became its own judge and executioner. Titles shifted, fortunes evaporated, and heads rolled. The king's word was law, But the king's heart was never constant. Each new marriage reshuffled the order of power, leaving the realm in perpetual suspense. Even foreign ambassadors struggled to discern where affection ended and policy began. To them, Henry's marriages appeared as the fever dreams of a monarch intoxicated by divine right. But within England, the people saw something darker: the slow erosion of certainty. The old world, where God blessed kings and marriage-bound nations, was crumbling. In its place rose a monarchy unshackled, dangerous, and absolute. When Anne Boleyn's eyes met the blade at the Tower, the silence that followed was not merely mourning. It was revelation. The kingdom understood then that in Tudor England, no vow was sacred, no promise eternal. The sanctity of marriage had been consumed by its purpose. Union that once symbolized peace had become an act of conquest. And yet, in that ruin, Henry found a kind of triumph. He had forged a nation loyal not to Rome, nor to moral law, but to him alone. Years later, when chroniclers described the reign, they wrote of grandeur and tyranny in equal measure. They spoke of a monarch who turned his personal longing into a doctrine, who remade faith to justify desire. The Reformation may have begun with theologians, but it was perfected by a king seeking an heir. Each subsequent marriage, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, became another chapter in the story of how love, under the Tudors, served politics more faithfully than God. But in the quiet spaces between decrees and executions, one can almost hear the echo of that first contract between Arthur and Catherine, signed in the name of alliance and ending in blood. It was the beginning of England's long descent into its own heart, where the line between duty and sin blurred until they became indistinguishable. And so the crown that Henry wore gleamed, not with sanctity, but with guilt. His reign left behind a kingdom transformed, richer, prouder, yet haunted. In breaking one marriage to save his soul, he had condemned generations to question whether love could ever exist without power, or power without betrayal. The documents that survive from his court, betrothals, annulments, accusations, form not a record of devotion, but of strategy. Each signature tells a story of survival, each seal a reminder that the price of kingship was always written in someone else's blood. In the end, even Henry could not escape the curse he had unleashed. The daughters born of his defiance, Mary and Elizabeth, would inherit not only his throne, but his shadow. One would burn her enemies in the name of faith. The other would outwit nations in the name of control. Both would rule alone, learning that in the Tudor world, marriage was not salvation, but surrender. The documents still rest in the archives, their edges blackened with time, their ink faint but indelible. Each bears witness to a dynasty that sought eternity through vows and found only ruin. The letters of Henry, written in fevered devotion, and the pleas of Catherine, penned in lonely exile, stand as opposing prayers to the same God, a God who remained silent as England remade itself beneath his gaze. Under the long shadow of Henry's reign, England entered a quieter, more perilous age. An age where every marriage was both a confession and a crime. The throne passed from the hands of kings to those of queens, and with it, the weapon of the betrothal became sharper still. The Reformation had severed the cords that once bound England to Rome, but it had also unmoored the moral compass that guided the realm. In this new landscape, love and treason could share the same sentence. Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest surviving child, was raised amid the wreckage of her mother's disgrace. She had watched Catherine of Aragon's banishment, heard the sermons that denounced her legitimacy, and lived through the slow erosion of her name. To the world, she was the forgotten princess. To herself, the rightful heir of a stolen destiny. When her father died and the brief, tragic reign of her brother Edward ended, Mary rose from exile not as a girl wronged, but as a monarch forged in grievance. Her reign was built on the promise of restoration, of faith, of bloodline, of justice to a mother wronged by ambition. Yet her own marriage would reveal how deeply the curse of Tudor alliances ran. In 1554, she announced her intention to wed Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, the same empire that had once stood as her mother's protector. It was a union not of affection, but of theology and statecraft. Mary sought to reunite England with Catholic Europe. Philip sought to extend Habsburg influence to the island once lost to Rome. The council protested, the people rioted, and whispers of conspiracy rose like smoke over London. They feared a foreign king would enslave England to Spain, that Mary would bear a half-Spanish heir and end the independence her father had fought to claim. The Wyatt rebellion that followed was crushed with ruthless efficiency, but its blood stained the crown. Even as the marriage proceeded, its foundation was poisoned by suspicion. The chroniclers wrote that Mary's heart burned for Philip, but the union itself was cold, a ceremony of two sovereigns, bound not by love but by duty and divine vengeance. Philip remained distant, both in person and spirit. When he departed for his wars, Mary was left with rumors, miscarriages, and the echo of prayers unanswered. Her courtiers feared her temper. Her people came to call her Bloody Mary, for the flames that consumed heretics in Smithfield. But those fires, though monstrous, were also an act of desperate faith, an attempt to cleanse a kingdom of the sin her father had birthed. In the end, she died childless. Her dreams of renewal dissolved into the same ash that had blackened her conscience. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, inherited not only the throne, but the legacy of those failed unions. She learned from her father's excess and her sister's tragedy that marriage for a Tudor was less a covenant than a trap. And so she chose a different weapon, the illusion of availability. The Virgin Queen, as she would later be called, was never truly wed, yet she was perpetually betrothed to ideas, to nations, to power itself. Each suitor who came to her court, French princes, Austrian archdukes, English courtiers, found himself caught in a web of charm and deferral. Elizabeth understood what no Tudor before her had fully grasped, that in refusing to marry, she could hold the world hostage to possibility. Her council urged her to secure an heir. Her people pleaded for stability. Yet she ruled alone, promising everything and granting nothing. Her suitors became pawns in her diplomacy, their hopes the currency of her dominion. In her, the art of betrothal reached its perfection, no longer a promise of union, but a performance of sovereignty. Yet even Elizabeth could not escape the dangers of love among her blood. The women of her family, those of Tudor descent, carried both privilege and peril in their veins. To marry without her consent was treason. To marry with it, nearly impossible. The most haunting example was Lady Mary Grey, granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. Her elder sibling, Lady Jane Grey, had already paid for ambition with her life. 9 days on a usurped throne, and then the cold mercy of the axe. Mary, smaller in stature but fierce in heart, seemed an unlikely threat. Yet when she secretly wed Thomas Keyes, the Queen's master of the horse, she sealed her own doom. The marriage was discovered almost immediately. Elizabeth's fury was not personal, it was political. A union of royal blood with a commoner, unsanctioned and unstrategic, undermined the entire architecture of power she had built. Mary Grey and her husband were imprisoned separately, their letters intercepted and filed among the records of treason. They pleaded for forgiveness, citing love and faith, but neither argument carried weight in a world where affection had long been outlawed. Mary wasted away in captivity, her husband dying before she ever saw him again. Their story, largely erased from public record, survived only in fragments, one of many testaments to the quiet brutality of Tudor love. Beyond these private tragedies, the great families of England continued to gamble their bloodlines on ambition. The Howards and Seymours, emboldened by their proximity to the throne, played dangerous games with Elizabeth's patience. Every whisper of courtship, every rumor of alliance was weighed as potential treason. The Queen's spies, ever watchful, turned betrothal into espionage. Letters between nobles were opened, coded messages deciphered, and more than one hopeful lover found the Tower's gates waiting at dawn. In this surveillance state of affection, even the act of looking could be fatal. The Duke of Norfolk, once one of Elizabeth's most trusted nobles, conspired to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, a rival claimant to the English throne. The union, had it succeeded, might have united 2 crowns and 2 faiths under one name. Instead, it ended in ruin. Norfolk was executed, Mary Stuart imprisoned, and the shadow of betrayal settled over the realm. The marriage that might have ended England's instability instead confirmed its paranoia. Thus, the forbidden marriage became both a motif and a warning. To marry without royal sanction was treason. To remain unmarried was survival. The Tudor bloodline, once spread through Europe by diplomacy, began to contract inward, devouring itself in suspicion. Elizabeth's refusal to wed ensured her autonomy, but doomed her dynasty. No husband, no heir, no successor of her body. Only a kingdom held together by her will and the careful choreography of appearances. As she aged, her courtiers grew more desperate, her portraits more idealized. The artists painted her as eternal, ageless, divine, the Virgin Queen untouched by time. But beneath the layers of white lead and symbolism lay the truth. She was the final echo of a family that had sacrificed love for dominion. In her solitude, England found stability. In her barrenness, identity. The people adored her as Gloriana, yet the courtiers who served her knew she was haunted by the same silence that had followed Catherine, Anne, and Mary before her. Historians would later debate whether Elizabeth ever loved Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man whose presence at her side stirred gossip and envy for decades. Their bond, recorded in glances and gestures rather than contracts, embodied the paradox of her reign. Devotion without consummation, promise without fulfillment. When his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the foot of a staircase, suspicion coiled like smoke around them both. No proof ever surfaced, and yet the stain remained. Elizabeth wept when Dudley died years later, his final letter found among her treasures when she herself passed. But even this affection, genuine or not, remained bound by the same iron logic. Love must never outweigh power. By the end of the century, the court that had once been the stage of Europe's most glittering alliances had become a gallery of ghosts. The daughters of England's nobility, once traded for peace and prestige, now languished unmarried, too dangerous to wed and too valuable to ignore. Elizabeth's courtiers wrote of her as a living paradox, the woman who had conquered by denial, who ruled through the ruins of every marriage her dynasty had arranged or destroyed. And in the silence that followed her laughter, they sensed the weight of centuries pressing down. The realization that the Tudors, for all their might, had trapped themselves within their own invention. Marriage, the instrument of their rise, had become the mechanism of their extinction. In the final decades of Elizabeth's reign, England itself seemed suspended between two worlds, half bathed in the golden light of triumph, half shadowed by decay. The Queen had survived rebellion, plague, assassination plots, and the endless scrutiny of men who mistook her restraint for weakness. Yet what truly sustained her rule was the same device that had haunted every Tudor before her: the management of love. For Elizabeth, affection was politics, and politics was survival. The art of marriage, its promises, its betrayals, its illusions, became her greatest masterpiece. By the 1580s, Europe watched her court with a mixture of awe and confusion. Kings had married for alliances, queens for heirs, but Elizabeth had mastered the opposite. She turned refusal into power. To France, she offered flirtation with the Duke of Anjou, calling him "my frog," her tone oscillating between maternal and coquettish. To Spain, she dangled the notion of reconciliation after decades of hostility. To her own nobles, she gave favors, glances, and impossible hopes. Each gesture was a negotiation, each smile a signature without ink. The royal chamber became a theater of performance. Courtiers adorned themselves like peacocks, rehearsing devotion with the precision of soldiers. They danced, composed verses, offered gifts shaped like hearts and crowns, and yet all understood the unspoken rule: none could touch what they adored. For the Virgin Queen was not a woman to be possessed. She was an idea to be worshipped. Among those who mistook illusion for intimacy was Robert Devereux, the young Earl of Essex. Handsome, impetuous, and dangerously ambitious, he entered Elizabeth's orbit as Leicester's heir in favor and temperament. At first, he charmed her with boldness. Where others bowed, he argued. Where others obeyed, he teased. Their relationship defied definition. Part maternal affection, part political dependence, part the echo of passions neither could safely acknowledge. For years, Essex embodied the vitality of a fading court, yet behind his wit lay impatience. He despised diplomacy, hungered for glory, and believed himself the destined champion of England's honor. When Elizabeth sent him to Ireland to suppress rebellion, he disobeyed her commands, returned unbidden, and burst into her chamber before she had been dressed, a symbolic violation of royal sanctity. It was not only defiance, it was Intimacy turned insolent. The court shuddered. The queen, humiliated, struck him in public. In that gesture lay the collapse of illusion. Love turned rebellion. Essex's downfall followed swiftly. His attempted uprising against the queen in 1601 was not the act of a revolutionary, but of a man who mistook personal grievance for destiny. When he mounted the scaffold, he asked for Elizabeth's forgiveness, though whether she granted it is uncertain. Witnesses said she grew silent in the days that followed, eating little, speaking less, as though the execution had severed the last human bond she permitted herself. Essex's death was not only the end of a man, it was the final marriage the Tudors ever consummated. The union of power and loneliness. Around her, the web of noble families continued to shift and tremble. The Howards, ever dangerous in their ambitions, had never forgiven the executions of their kin under Henry VIII and Mary I. The Seymours, descended from Jane Seymour's brief triumph, maneuvered carefully, aware that proximity to the throne could kill as easily as it could elevate. The Dudleys, haunted by the ghosts of Amy Robsart and Lady Jane Grey, walked the razor's edge between loyalty and ruin. Each house bore the scars of a marriage once meant to secure power, and instead had invited destruction. Elizabeth understood these ghosts intimately. She wore them like armor. The memory of Anne Boleyn's downfall, the mother she had been taught to forget, sharpened her instincts. She trusted no husband, no counsel, no blood but her own. To govern as a woman in a man's world was to transform every vulnerability into theater. Thus, she wielded her image like a weapon. The painted portraits, the jeweled gowns, the orchestrated rituals of adoration. They were not vanity, but survival, for if she could be worshipped, she could not be replaced. In this calculated solitude, she found strange freedom. Her unmarried state became mythic, sanctified as divine choice rather than mortal fear. Preachers compared her to Deborah and the Virgin Mary. Poets called her Astrea, the goddess of justice returned to earth. To her subjects, she was eternal, untouched by passion, immune to age. Yet, beneath the surface of these symbols lay a more human truth. The letters she wrote in private reveal weariness, doubt, and a loneliness too vast for any crown to conceal. She referred to herself as a hollow crown set upon frail flesh. She feared sleep, for in dreams her dead rose to accuse her. Anne's ghost, Mary's pyres, Essex's pleading eyes. The chroniclers of her time dared not record her vulnerability. They preserved only the spectacle, the queen triumphant at Tilbury, addressing her troops in armor, declaring that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. Those words became scripture for a nation hungry for strength. Yet the woman who spoke them had long learned that to survive as a monarch, she must sacrifice herself as a woman. The politics of her later years were less about conquest than containment. Without an heir, every noble family became a potential claimant, every marriage a conspiracy. The question of succession loomed like a gathering storm. Parliament implored her to name an heir. She refused. To choose was to invite her own death. And so she prolonged uncertainty, her reign stretching into myth, while her body failed in silence. Meanwhile, beyond the gilded halls, the world changed. The generation that had known Henry's tyranny and Mary's zealotry was gone. England's new men, merchants, explorers, scholars, looked outward to the sea. The age of empire began as the age of marriage ended. Elizabeth's celibate sovereignty, paradoxically, birthed a restless nation. Without heirs of her blood, she left behind heirs of her ambition. Raleigh's voyages, Drake's raids, the East India Company's charter, all were born of her refusal to yield her power to any man. Yet even these triumphs could not dispel the encroaching twilight. In the final years, her court grew somber, her favorites aged or executed, her mirrors covered in silk to soften the reflection of mortality. Observers noted that she clung to her jewels, her rituals, her music, as though to preserve the illusion that the Virgin Queen was untouched by time. When courtiers knelt before her, they saw not divinity but exhaustion, not radiance but endurance. In those last months, the kingdom whispered of succession. James VI of Scotland waited beyond the border, patient and pragmatic, his claim strengthened by descent from Henry VII's eldest daughter. He too was the product of a Tudor marriage, once arranged to secure peace. Thus, even as Elizabeth's life waned, the echo of those ancient contracts persisted. The dynasty that had risen through marriage would now die by the absence of one. The Queen withdrew from court to Richmond Palace, where the tapestries muffled sound, and the air smelled faintly of wax and rosewater. She refused her bed, sitting upright for days, her eyes fixed on nothing visible. Some said she feared sleep, because she had seen in dreams a procession of dead queens. Her mother, her sister, her cousin, each holding a crown that turned to ash. Others claimed she simply feared what awaited her when she could no longer perform the part the world demanded. When she finally slipped into silence in the spring of 1603, no priest was called, no husband's hand to hold hers. The courtiers stood at a distance, uncertain whether to grieve the woman or the legend. Her body lay surrounded by candles, her rings removed, her jewels catalogued. Outside, the bells tolled for a dynasty's end. And yet, in that passing, England did not collapse. The crown moved smoothly to James, uniting the thrones of England and Scotland at last. The people mourned her as the mother of their nation, though she had borne no child. It was a paradox worthy of her reign, the Virgin Queen who left behind an empire, the unmarried woman who bound a realm. In the annals of history, Elizabeth's celibacy is often painted as triumph, a symbol of restraint, intellect, and divine favor. But beneath the triumph lies tragedy. She had inherited a curse forged by her father's passions and her mother's fall. That love for a Tudor was synonymous with ruin. Every generation before her had tested that truth. She alone refused. Her victory was isolation, her crown the price of her heart. In the dim archives where her letters rest, pages fragile as the breath of centuries, there remains one constant refrain, that she ruled not by marriage but by memory. Each promise unfulfilled, each suitor denied, became another strand in the web that held her throne intact. To read those words is to understand that Elizabeth's life was itself a betrothal, not to a man, but to an idea, England. And like all Tudor unions, it was both sacred and cursed. The bells that tolled for Elizabeth's death did not merely mourn a queen, they marked the end of an idea. The Tudor name, once synonymous with vitality and defiance, dissolved into echo. Yet in that echo lay the unspent power of a century defined by love turned into law and vows that chained the living to the dead. The kingdom that James inherited was peaceful on the surface, its wars won, its treasury stable. But beneath the gold leaf of stability, the ghosts of those hidden betrothals still stirred. When James VI of Scotland crossed the border to become James I of England, he brought with him the blood of both victors and victims of Tudor ambition. His grandmother, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, had once been bartered in marriage to James IV of Scotland to secure an alliance that promised perpetual peace. Instead, that union delivered generations of conflict and suspicion. Margaret herself had lived out the Tudor paradox, used as an instrument of diplomacy, later condemned for loving beyond it. She married for love after her husband's death, defying her counsel, and lost the guardianship of her own children for it. Now, a century later, her bloodline returned to claim the English crown, as though history itself had circled back to collect its debt. The courtiers who knelt before James understood the irony. The new king's claim was born not of conquest, but of contract, a marriage long forgotten by most of those who now served him. The web of alliances spun by Henry VII had finally fulfilled its purpose, though not as he intended. In uniting the two crowns, James accomplished through inheritance what war had failed to achieve. But to the faithful of the old order, the union felt less like fulfillment than reckoning. It was as if the restless spirits of the Tudor dead had demanded that their unfinished vows be redeemed in blood and ink. London in 1603 was a city between epochs. The air still smelled of incense from Elizabeth's funeral rites, and yet proclamations of a new era already fluttered in the streets. James, pragmatic and curious, sought to steady what he had inherited, to mend the fractures that ran through church and court alike. But he soon discovered that peace could not erase memory. The Tudor habit of secrecy, of controlling affection as policy, had seeped into the bones of governance itself. Ministers courted favor as suitors once courted queens. Alliances shifted not by love, but by flattery and fear. The entire kingdom had learned the Tudor lesson, that loyalty was a currency to be spent carefully, and that the heart was never private. Even in his own court, James faced the lingering consequences of that creed. Rumors swirled of his fondness for favorites, young men whose proximity to the king invited envy and intrigue. Letters between them, full of tenderness and ambiguous devotion, would later scandalize historians. To some, these affections seemed the inverted mirror of Elizabeth's calculated restraint. To others, they were simply the continuation of a monarchy where intimacy and politics had become indistinguishable. The stage had changed, but the performance remained the same. As the years passed, the Tudor dynasty transformed from living memory into myth. Chroniclers began to write their histories, smoothing the rough edges of tyranny into parable, turning queens into saints and sinners alike. Catherine of Aragon became the martyr of conscience, Anne Boleyn the temptress who birthed reform. Mary Tudor, the zealot consumed by faith. And Elizabeth, the goddess who reigned alone above desire. Each woman, stripped of flesh, became a symbol. Yet in private correspondence, those faint scratches of ink preserved by archivists Their humanity survives. The tremor in a farewell, the plea for forgiveness, the confession of fear. It is through those letters that one senses the true continuity of the age. For while crowns changed hands and dynasties crumbled, the machinery of marriage remained constant, its invisible gears grinding behind every treaty, every rebellion, every birth. The betrothal, once a sacred promise, had become a mechanism of state so ingrained that even its absence haunted the throne. When Elizabeth refused to marry, she did not destroy the system. She made herself its final offering. Her celibacy was the last, purest form of Tudor union, a marriage between monarch and myth. The early Stuart years were filled with attempts to untangle what the Tudors had bound. James sought to marry his children into continental alliances that would soothe the old religious divisions. His daughter Elizabeth, married to Frederick of the Palatinate, carried with her the same expectations that had once burdened Catherine of Aragon: to unite faith and crown, to bear heirs who would restore equilibrium to a fractured Christendom. Yet her marriage, too, would ignite wars rather than end them, drawing England into the cataclysm of Europe's 30 Years' War. It was as though the curse of Tudor diplomacy, the belief that love could heal what politics had broken, had crossed the generations. Back in England, another ghost stirred in the national conscience. Mary, Queen of Scots, whose execution Elizabeth had ordered, was slowly canonized in popular imagination as both victim and warning. Her life, woven of marriages, betrayals, and imprisonments, embodied the full tragedy of royal affection. Her son now sat upon the throne of her executioner. It was an irony almost too vast for the chroniclers to comprehend, that the child of a doomed queen should inherit the peace her cousin had died to preserve. In this reversal, one sees the final act of the Tudor play, a dynasty destroyed by its own desire to control destiny. The archivists who now serve in shadowed rooms of the State Papers Office sometimes speak of the smell that lingers when a Tudor document is unsealed, the faint trace of iron gall ink, beeswax, and something else, something human. It is the scent of hands that wrote not for love, but for survival, of men and women who believed that promises could outlast mortality. When those scrolls are unrolled, they crack like bones. The seals crumble, revealing names half erased, words that no longer have legal power, but still pulse with meaning. For the good of our realm, they always begin, as though repeating a spell meant to bind chaos itself. In that phrase lies the essence of their age. Every secret contract, every forbidden marriage, every annulled vow, each was justified as service to the realm, even when it destroyed the souls of those who signed it. The Tudors had lived and died beneath that creed, believing that personal sacrifice was the cost of national greatness. But history, indifferent to their intentions, recorded only the consequences: broken families, fractured faiths, and a lineage that ended in solitude. And yet, paradoxically, their ruin became England's foundation. The very conflicts born of their unions, religious, political, emotional, forced the nation to define itself beyond blood. The English Reformation, the strengthening of Parliament, the rise of exploration and literature, all grew from the fractures they left behind. The dynasty that sought eternity through marriage had, in its failure, given birth to modernity. When scholars speak of the Tudor legacy, they often focus on the splendor of its courts, the eloquence of its poets, the brutality of its politics. But there is another legacy, quieter and more enduring: the idea that love, when entangled with power, becomes history's most dangerous invention. In every age since, monarchs and ministers have repeated the Tudor experiment in new forms. Treaties signed with smiles, alliances forged through charm rather than conviction. And always, behind the diplomacy, there lingers the ghost of that first contract signed in candlelight, when a boy named Arthur and a girl named Catherine were promised to each other in the name of peace. Centuries later, the ink of that promise has faded, but its shadow remains. It lives in the concept of statecraft itself, in the belief that hearts can be negotiated, that loyalty can be legislated, that the future can be arranged by those too afraid to trust the present. The Tudors believed these things absolutely, and in doing so, they built both their glory and their tomb. If one listens closely in the silence of Westminster's archives, one might still hear the faint whisper of parchment unfurling, the rustle of a gown across stone, the murmur of oaths spoken in secrecy. The words themselves are lost, but the intent endures. For the good of the realm. The phrase repeats like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. And so the story ends where it began, in a room lit by a single candle, with two names joined on a page and a kingdom waiting in the dark. The Tudors are gone, their blood scattered among the royal houses of Europe, their monuments eroded by time. But the contracts remain, brittle yet unbroken, binding not people, but ideas. They remind us that beneath every crown lies a covenant, written in both ink and sorrow. History closes the ledger of their reign with reverence and unease. The dynasty that defined a century now exists only in memory, yet its shadow stretches still. For behind every empire built on love, there waits the silence of consequence, a silence that the Tudors, in their brilliance and blindness alike, never learned to hear. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the reach of time, the ghosts of their promises still whisper to each other across eternity, reminding us that no vow once spoken is ever truly forgotten. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.